My name is Riley Vance, and I am 24 years old, a woman who has spent every waking hour of the last 4 years building a life out of the wreckage of a childhood defined by instability. I work as a junior logistics coordinator for a mid-sized shipping firm in Savannah, Georgia, a role that requires a level of precision and punctuality that borders on the obsessive, because when you grow up never knowing if the lights will turn on when you flip the switch, you learn to worship at the altar of a well-maintained spreadsheet. For 4 years, I have not missed a single day of work, not for a flu, not for a broken heart, and certainly not for the drama that seems to follow my family like a persistent shadow. But this morning, the shadow finally caught up to me. I stood on the cracked, sun-bleached concrete of our driveway, the humid Georgia air already thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, staring at the empty rectangular space where my car should have been. It wasn't just any car. It was a 2019 Galactic Aqua Mica Toyota Camry, a vehicle I had purchased with 48 months of disciplined, agonizingly precise payments of $412 each. I remember the smell of the interior the day I drove it off the lot, that crisp, synthetic promise of a fresh start. And I remember the calluses on my hands from the overtime shifts I took to ensure that the bank never had a reason to send a tow truck. Yet the spot was empty. The oil stain from a minor leak 3 months ago was the only evidence that my primary means of survival had ever existed. I had to do it, Riley. The $6,840 property tax lien was arriving at 10 o'clock a.m., and they were going to put a lock on the front door. My mother, Deborah, gasped. She was standing on the sagging porch of the house I'd been trying to save for 3 years, her hands trembling as she clutched a cheap single-ply paper napkin from the Waffle House down the street. Her eyes were rimmed with red, a familiar sight that used to inspire pity in me, but now only stoked a cold, hard ember of resentment. She looked smaller than she had a year ago, draped in a faded floral blouse from Target that had seen better days, her hair a messy bird's nest of graying strands. Behind her, my older brother, Jason, leaned against the doorframe of our 3-bedroom ranch-style home on Willow Creek Road. He was 27, still wearing a t-shirt with a bleach stain across the chest, looking at his fingernails as if the theft of my livelihood was merely a minor clerical error. The betrayal wasn't just the car, it was the calculation. They had waited until I was in the shower, the sound of the water masking the low rumble of the flatbed truck they'd called. They had handed over my keys I had entrusted to my mother for emergencies only, and watched as my independence was hauled away to a predatory, we-buy-cars-for-cash lot 3 miles away. The sheer audacity of the lie was what choked me. My mother's voice was a frantic, high-pitched warble as she explained that the county tax assessor was on their way, that the 2023 property tax bill had gone unpaid because Jason's landscaping business had hit a rough patch. Jason's business, if you could call it that, consisted of a rusted 2005 Ford F-150 and a lawnmower that spent more time in pieces on the garage floor than it did cutting grass. I knew for a fact that I had given my mother $500 every month specifically for the escrow and taxes, a total of $6,000 over the last year, which should have covered the bill. But here she was, claiming a lien of $6,840 was about to cost us the roof over our heads. She reached out to touch my arm, her fingers cold and damp, but I pulled back. The silence between us was punctuated only by the distant sound of a neighbor's leaf blower and the rhythmic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I looked at the driveway again, the emptiness of it feeling like a physical weight in my chest. That car represented 3,216 hours of my life spent in a cubicle, tracking containers from Shanghai to Savannah, making sure the gears of global commerce turned while my own world was grinding to a halt. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My father, who had been sitting in his tattered recliner inside, finally shuffled out. He was 62, a man who had once been a foreman at the International Paper Mill, but had retired early due to a back injury that became a convenient excuse for a decade of lethargy. He was wearing a pair of New Balance sneakers that were gray with age and a pair of cargo shorts. He didn't look me in the eye. He just looked at the driveway and muttered something about how family has to make sacrifices. The hypocrisy was a bitter pill, dissolving on my tongue and staining everything I knew about the people who raised me. They were standing there, 3 adults who had collectively contributed less to the household than I had in the last fiscal year, justifying the liquidation of my only asset to cover a debt that shouldn't have existed. Deborah's napkin was now a shredded mess of white pulp in her hands. She started talking about the greater good and how Jason would help me get to work until I could save up for a beater. The idea of Jason, a man who couldn't wake up before noon unless there was a beer in it for him, driving me to my 8 a.m. shift in his exhaust-fuming truck, was a joke that wasn't funny. I thought about my office at the port, the sleek glass and steel building where I was respected, where people called me Ms. Vance and relied on my reports. I thought about the professional wardrobe I'd carefully curated, the Ann Taylor blazers and the Clark's pumps, and the indignity of arriving at that world in a truck that smelled of stale tobacco and failure. I walked past them into the house, my boots echoing on the laminate flooring I had paid to have installed in 2022. I went straight to the kitchen, a space that smelled of burnt toast and the cheap lavender air freshener my mother used to hide the scent of neglect. The kitchen table was a cluttered graveyard of male, half-empty soda bottles and Jason's car keys. I didn't head for the fridge or the coffee pot. I headed for the small, decorative ceramic rooster on the counter where my mother kept the important papers. My hands were steady, a stark contrast to the earthquake happening inside my soul. I began to sift through the piles, utility bills from Georgia Power, advertisements for local grocery stores, and medical statements for my father's physical therapy. And then I found it. Tucked inside a folded flyer for a local pizza place was a small, inconspicuous slip of paper. It wasn't a tax lien notice. It wasn't a final warning from the Chatham County Tax Commissioner's office. It was a receipt from a local jewelry and pawn shop on Broughton Street, dated 3 days ago. It was for a $12 valuation fee and a temporary storage insurance binder. But more importantly, beneath it was the real paper trail, a simple printed statement of account for the property taxes. The total due wasn't $6,840. The taxes had been paid 6 months ago. The lien was a total fabrication, a ghost story conjured up to justify a desperate move. The $12 paper trail in my hand was the smoking gun, the tiny piece of evidence that proved this wasn't about saving a home. It was about funding a fantasy. As I looked closer at the documents hidden behind the rooster, I saw a brochure for a turnkey business opportunity in Florida, a jet ski rental franchise that Jason had been obsessed with for months. The cost of the buy-in? Exactly what my 2019 Camry, with its low mileage and pristine maintenance record, would fetch at a quick sale lot. They hadn't sold my car to keep the lights on. They had sold it to buy Jason a new life at the expense of mine. My mother's gasping and trembling were nothing more than a performance, a low-budget play designed to guilt me into silence while they dismantled the foundation I had built for myself. I stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the sunlight hitting the dust motes dancing in the air. I looked at the $12 receipt, the ink slightly faded but the truth screaming off the page. I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. For 24 years, I had been the reliable one, the girl who did the dishes, the teenager who worked 2 jobs to buy her own prom dress, the adult who paid the property taxes while the rest of the family treated life like a permanent vacation. I was the junior logistics coordinator for my family's chaos, always rerouting the damage, always making sure the deliveries of their responsibilities arrived on time. But as I gripped that $12 piece of paper, I realized that the shipment was being canceled. Outside, I could hear them talking in hushed, urgent tones, probably rehearsing the next act of their drama, unaware that I was standing in the kitchen holding the script they'd tried to hide. I looked at the clock on the microwave, the one I'd bought when the old one caught fire because Jason tried to microwave a foil-wrapped burrito. It was 7:42 a.m. In 18 minutes, I was supposed to be at my desk, opening the manifests for the morning arrivals. Instead, I was standing in a house that felt like a cage, looking at a receipt that cost $12 but had just cost my mother and brother their daughter and sister. The $12 paper trail was the end of the Riley Vance they thought they could break. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would be as precise and unrelenting as one of my logistics schedules. They wanted to talk about property and locks? Fine, we would talk about property. But first, we were going to talk about the exact market value of a betrayal. The air in the kitchen felt stagnant, the hum of the refrigerator sounding like a low-frequency alarm. I could see my mother through the window, still clutching that napkin, looking toward the road as if expecting the phantom taxman to appear and validate her lie. She didn't know that the only person coming for her was the daughter she had just robbed. My father's heavy footsteps thudded on the porch steps as he headed back toward his chair, the sound of a man who had long ago traded his integrity for a quiet life. I tucked the receipt into my blazer pocket, the sharp edge of the paper digging into my thumb. It was a small pain, manageable and focused, unlike the vast, sprawling ache of realizing your family is your greatest liability. I was done being the safety net. The logistics of my life were changing, and for the first time, I wasn't going to account for their losses. I was going to ensure my own survival, regardless of the cost to those who had so casually discarded mine. The contrast in our household was not just a source of tension. It was a visceral, disgusting manifestation of a hierarchy that had been cemented long before I was even old enough to understand the value of a dollar. While I functioned as the silent, invisible engine keeping the family's crumbling infrastructure from total collapse, my 27-year-old sister, Mackenzie, existed as the gilded centerpiece, the family jewel whose every whim was treated as a royal decree. My daily reality was defined by a calculated, almost monastic austerity that would have broken anyone with less resolve. I wore $22 scrub-style work pants from a generic medical supply outlet, the kind of polyester blend fabric that never quite felt soft against the skin and pilled after the first 3 washes, because they were durable enough to withstand the rigors of the logistics warehouse and cheap enough to allow me to funnel every spare cent into my savings. Every single morning, while the house was still hushed in that gray, pre-dawn stillness, I stood at the laminate kitchen counter and assembled a tuna sandwich, meticulously measuring out the generic mayo to ensure the cans lasted the full week, all so I could save exactly $150 a month that would otherwise be lost to the predatory prices of the Office Park Deli. That $150 was a lifeline, a monthly brick in the wall I was building between myself and the generational poverty my parents seemed determined to embrace. But it was a wall they were constantly trying to dismantle from the other side. Meanwhile, Mackenzie lived in a world where money was an abstract concept, a phantom resource that appeared whenever she pouted or posted a filtered photo of her avocado toast. She styled herself as a lifestyle influencer, a title that carried the weight of a feather and provided exactly $0 in actual spendable income, yet she lived with the unearned confidence of a billionaire. Her stage was a 1,100-square-foot luxury condo in the newly gentrified Starland district of Savannah, a space featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, polished concrete floors, and a rent of $2,450 a month that was as fictional to her as the brand deals she claimed were just around the corner. While I was calculating the cost of a gallon of milk down to the penny, Mackenzie was drowning in a $14,000 mountain of credit card debt, a secret hemorrhaging of cash that our mother, Deborah, desperately and pathetically covered by raiding the family's dwindling accounts and, as I now realized with a sickening clarity, by liquidating my hard-earned assets. The injustice of it was a physical weight in my lungs, a thick layer of resentment that built up every time I saw Mackenzie's curated Instagram feed, filled with soft focus shots of her designer loungewear and artisanal candles that cost more than my entire weekly grocery budget. The disparity reached a breaking point on a Tuesday that felt like a descent into a private circle of hell, a morning when the Georgia sky had turned the color of a bruised plum and opened up in a freezing, relentless rainstorm. My Toyota Camry was already gone, though at the time I was still being fed the lie that it was in the shop for a phantom transmission issue that only my brother Jason could diagnose. I had no choice but to wrap my professional work clothes in a cheap plastic poncho and begin the 1.2-mile trek to the nearest bus stop on Victory Drive. The rain was not a gentle mist. It was a cold, driving assault that soaked through my shoes within the first 100 yards, the water seeping into my socks and turning my feet into blocks of ice. Every step on the cracked sidewalk was a reminder of my station in this family, the designated laborer who was expected to endure any hardship without complaint. I arrived at the bus stop shivering, my hair plastered to my forehead, standing under a rusted metal overhang that leaked directly onto my shoulder, waiting for a bus that was 14 minutes late according to the flickering digital display. As I stood there, clutching my damp lunch bag and trying to keep my dignity from dissolving in the gutter, my phone buzzed with a series of frantic text messages in the family group chat. It wasn't an inquiry about my safety or a check-in on how I was getting to work. It was Mackenzie, broadcasting her latest catastrophe from the comfort of her climate-controlled sanctuary. She was complaining, with a level of vitriol usually reserved for major human rights violations, that her new $300 Italian espresso machine was too loud. She claimed the grinding of the beans was giving her a migraine and ruined the aesthetic of her morning routine video, and she demanded that Deborah come over immediately to help her pack it up for a return, or better yet, bring her a latte from the boutique cafe downstairs to compensate for her trauma. The sheer, unadulterated narcissism of the request made my vision blur with rage. While I was bracing myself against a freezing gale, worried that the dampness would ruin my only pair of decent work shoes, my sister was experiencing an emotional breakdown over the decibel level of a luxury appliance that she hadn't even paid for herself. Deborah's response in the chat was a flurry of heart emojis and reassurances, promising that she would stop by as soon as she finished some errands. Errands I now knew involved lying to me about tax liens and scouting out the best price for my stolen car. The dynamic was so skewed, so fundamentally broken, that I felt like I was living in a parallel dimension where common sense and fairness had been outlawed. Mackenzie was the sun around which my parents orbited, a failing star that consumed everything in its path, while I was the dark matter, necessary for the structure but never acknowledged. My sister's $14,000 debt was treated like a minor character flaw, a charming quirk of a creative soul, while my disciplined $412 car payments were seen as a resource to be harvested. They looked at my stability not as a sign of my success, but as a surplus they were entitled to skim. I remembered a dinner from 3 months prior, a rare occasion where we were all gathered in the dining room of the Willow Creek house under the dim yellow light of a chandelier that was missing half its bulbs. Mackenzie had spent 45 minutes explaining the importance of her brand identity, using words like synergy and engagement while picking at a salad that cost $20 and had been delivered by a courier. I had sat there in my $22 pants, listening to my father praise her ambition while my mother nodded fervently, her eyes glazed with a mixture of pride and desperation. When I tried to mention that I had just received a glowing performance review and a modest 3% cost of living adjustment at the logistics firm, my father had simply asked if that meant I could start chipping in more for the emergency fund. I realized then that in their eyes, my purpose was to be the quiet provider for Mackenzie's loud failures. My sister's lifestyle was a house of cards built on the wet, shivering back of my labor, and my parents were the architects of this grand delusion. The bus finally pulled up, splashing a wave of oily street water over the curb and onto my shins, the doors hissing open to reveal a crowded, humid interior that smelled of wet wool and exhaustion. I climbed aboard, tapping my transit card with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and found a sliver of standing room between a construction worker and an elderly woman clutching a damp newspaper. As the bus lurched forward, I pulled my phone out one last time to see Mackenzie had posted a story on Instagram, a black and white photo of her hand draped over her forehead, captioned with a note about how hard it was to be a perfectionist in a world that didn't understand her art. The espresso machine sat in the background, a gleaming silver monument to the money they had bled out of me. I looked at the $12 receipt still tucked into my blazer pocket, the paper now slightly softened by the humidity, and I felt a cold, crystalline resolve harden inside me. The contrast was no longer just disgusting, it was unsustainable. They had spent years convincing me that my role was to sacrifice so that the family jewel could shine, but they had forgotten that a jewel without a setting is just a rock, and I was done being the earth they trampled on to keep her elevated. I was Riley Vance, and if they wanted to live in Mackenzie's world of luxury and lies, they could do it without the $500 a month I contributed to their survival, and without the car they had stolen to buy her another week of pretending. The bus rumbled through the flooded streets of Savannah, and with every block we put between the Willow Creek house and my future, I felt the ties of a toxic loyalty snapping one by one, leaving me with nothing but the shivering cold and the burning heat of a truth they were about to be forced to swallow. The betrayal did not announce itself with a roar or a cinematic explosion, but rather with a sound so intimately familiar to my ears that it felt like a ghost whispering directly into my soul. It happened at exactly 1:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, a day that should have been defined by the mundane logistics of shipping manifests and inventory tracking at the port, but instead became the moment my reality fractured beyond repair. I was standing on the sun-baked sidewalk of Broughton Street in downtown Savannah, just outside a high-end boutique cafe where the air smelled of roasted Arabica beans and expensive perfume, waiting for a coworker to finish an errand. The humidity was already beginning to bead on my forehead, but I froze when I heard it. A very specific, high-pitched, rhythmic whine coming from a car turning the corner. It was the unmistakable sound of a faulty serpentine belt, a minor mechanical quirk that I had been planning to fix with my next $300 maintenance budget. I knew that sound better than I knew the sound of my own mother's voice. It was the specific mechanical heartbeat of my 2019 Galactic Aqua Mica Toyota Camry, the car I had spent 48 months of my life paying for with blood, sweat, and absolute fiscal discipline. But as the vehicle pulled into a no-parking zone directly in front of the cafe, it didn't look like my car anymore. The deep, sophisticated teal-blue paint that I had washed and waxed by hand every Sunday morning had been completely smothered under a garish, shimmering, electric neon purple vinyl wrap. I knew enough about the local automotive market to know that a full wrap of that quality, with its seamless edges and metallic flake finish, would cost roughly $3,200 at any professional shop in the city. The sight of it was a physical blow to my stomach, a violent intrusion of my sister's aesthetic onto my survival. The car I had bled for, the vehicle that was supposed to have been sold to pay a non-existent property tax lien to save our family home, had been transformed into a mobile billboard for a lifestyle that was rotting us from the inside out. It was no longer a tool for a working woman to get to her job. It had been mutilated into a prop for a failing influencer's digital fantasy. The door swung open with that familiar, solid thud I had heard thousands of times, and my sister, Mackenzie, stepped out onto the pavement with the grace of someone who has never had to worry about the cost of the ground they walk on. She was wearing a pair of $420 Celine Triumph sunglasses that obscured half her face, their gold hardware glinting mockingly in the Georgia sun. Her hair was perfectly blown out, a cascade of blonde waves that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and she was laughing, a light, airy sound that felt like sandpaper against my nerves, as she leaned back into the car to grab her designer handbag. She walked toward the cafe entrance with an air of absolute entitlement, stopping only to take a quick, pouting selfie against the hood of the purple-wrapped car, her thumb hitting the screen of an iPhone 15 Pro Max that I knew for a fact was on a payment plan Deborah was struggling to meet. She was heading inside to grab a $9.50 oat milk latte, a drink that cost more than my entire prepared lunch, while I stood less than 20 feet away, vibrating with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. I didn't call out to her. I didn't scream or make a scene on the crowded street. I moved like a person in a trance, my feet heavy as lead as I walked toward the rear of the vehicle, the heat from the engine radiating off the neon purple vinyl in waves. I reached the back passenger side wheel and knelt down, my $22 work pants stretching tight against my knees. There, hidden beneath the edge of the expensive purple wrap that hadn't quite managed to tuck perfectly into the wheel well, was the scar. It was a 4-inch curb scratch I had made back in November of 2021 while trying to navigate a tight parking garage during a tropical storm. I had cried that day because I couldn't afford to fix it, and I had eventually touched it up with a small bottle of manufacturer-matched paint that never quite hid the texture of the gouged metal. Touching that scratch was like touching a wound on my own body. This was my car. This was the vehicle my mother claimed had been surrendered to the county to prevent us from being homeless. This was the asset they told me was gone forever, sacrificed for the greater good of the Vance family. The level of technical and emotional deception required to pull this off was staggering. To wrap a car in electric neon purple takes days of preparation. They had likely dropped it off at the shop the very hour it disappeared from my driveway. The $3,200 for the wrap, plus the cost of Mackenzie's new accessories, suggested that they hadn't just stolen my car. They had used the title, which I had foolishly kept in the glove box, to take out a high-interest title loan, or perhaps they had simply lied to a local dealer to get a cash advance. Every time the engine idled and that serpentine belt let out its characteristic chirp, it was a reminder of their laziness. They hadn't even bothered to fix the mechanical issue I'd been worried about. They had only cared about the surface, about the color, about how it would look in a grid of squares on a social media app. My sister was driving a stolen vehicle that still needed an $80 belt replacement while wearing sunglasses that cost 5 times that amount. I stood up and looked through the window into the interior. My heart broke all over again. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back to accommodate Mackenzie's long legs, and the pristine dashboard I had kept dusted with microfiber cloths was now cluttered with empty Starbucks cups, crumpled receipts from Zara, and a loose pile of makeup testers. The scent of my car, that clean, neutral smell of a well-maintained machine, had been replaced by a cloying, heavy cloud of vanilla perfume and the stale odor of fast food. It was a desecration. I looked at the license plate and saw a temporary tag fluttering in the breeze, a clear sign that they were trying to bypass the registration system, likely using the business Jason claimed to be starting as a front for the paperwork. The sheer, staggering injustice of it made the buildings around me seem to tilt. While I was walking 1.2 miles in freezing rain to catch a bus, while I was eating tuna sandwiches to save pennies, while I was losing sleep over a $6,840 tax line that never existed, my sister was cruising Broughton Street in a neon-wrapped version of my life. My mother had looked me in the eye and used the threat of homelessness to steal my only means of independence, all to give Mackenzie a fresh vibe for her brand. They didn't see me as a person, they saw me as a surplus. I was the silent partner in their fraud, the unwitting investor in Mackenzie's delusions of grandeur. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my fingers trembling as I opened the camera app. I didn't take a selfie. I took a high-resolution photo of the VIN number visible through the windshield. I took a photo of the curb scratch. I took a photo of Mackenzie through the cafe window, smiling as the barista handed her the latte she hadn't earned. I felt the $12 receipt from the pawn shop in my pocket, the paper that had started this journey of discovery. The $12 paper trail was just the beginning. Now I had the physical evidence of the crime. They had taken a 2019 Toyota Camry, a reliable, sensible, hard-working vehicle, and tried to turn it into a fantasy. But a fantasy cannot run on a faulty serpentine belt, and a lie cannot survive when the person it was built upon finally decides to stand up. I realized then that my family's greatest mistake wasn't stealing the car. It was stealing it from someone who understood logistics. They understood how to hide things in plain sight, but they didn't understand how to track the movement of assets, how to verify claims, or how to identify the specific mechanical signatures of a life built on precision. They thought I would be too broken by the loss of the house to notice the loss of the car. They thought I would stay in my lane, wearing my $22 pants and packing my tuna, forever grateful that we still had a roof over our heads. They were wrong. As I walked away from the neon purple eyesore, leaving Mackenzie to finish her latte in peace for the very last time, I wasn't Riley the victim anymore. I was Riley the auditor. And the audit of the Vance family was going to be brutal, comprehensive, and public. I felt the cold air of the cafe's air conditioning hit my back as I turned the corner, the sound of that squealing belt fading into the distance, a dying scream of the life they thought they could keep stealing from me. I had the VIN, I had the receipt, and I had a 4-year record of every single cent I had poured into that house. The family jewel was about to find out that when you build your throne out of someone else's bones, you shouldn't be surprised when they decide to move. The clock on my computer screen clicked over to 2:45 a.m., the glowing digits casting a harsh, artificial pallor over my hands as I sat at my cramped desk in the corner of my bedroom. The air in the house was deathly still, thick with the stagnant warmth of a Georgia summer and the unspoken betrayals of the people sleeping just down the hallway. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around a cold, condensation-slicked $3 energy drink, a generic brand from the 7-Eleven on the corner, and felt the sharp, metallic tang of the caffeine hit the back of my throat as I stared into the darkness. I wasn't just awake. I was vibrating with a cold, analytical fury that had completely bypassed the stage of grief and landed squarely in the realm of tactical planning. It was in this silence, punctuated only by the distant hum of the central air conditioning unit struggling against the humidity, that the full mechanics of the theft finally clicked into place within my mind. I realized then that Deborah hadn't just sold my car through some bureaucratic loophole or a moment of shared family desperation. She had committed a series of calculated, felonious acts that required a level of premeditation I had previously thought her incapable of achieving. I turned my head to look at the small $120 biometric safe that sat tucked away on the bottom shelf of my closet, a device I had purchased specifically to protect my most sensitive documents from the very people who shared my DNA. I got up, my $22 work pants swishing quietly in the dark, and knelt before the small black box. When I pressed my thumb to the scanner, the red light blinked 3 times, an error code I had never seen before. My heart didn't race. It slowed down, becoming a heavy, rhythmic thud in my chest as I inspected the casing. There were faint, jagged silver scratches around the emergency key bypass lock, marks that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. She had used a screwdriver, or perhaps one of my father's rusted workshop tools, to force the manual override. Inside, the space where my vehicle title should have been was a hollow, mocking void. She had broken into my private property, reached past my birth certificate and my meager emergency cash, and snatched the blue-bordered document that represented my greatest achievement. To sell that car, she would have needed my signature. She would have had to sit at a desk, perhaps at that shady cash-for-cars lot on the outskirts of town, and carefully trace the loops and slants of my name onto the back of the title. She had forged my identity, effectively erasing my legal existence to facilitate a transaction that funded my sister's neon-purple delusions. The realization was a crystalline moment of clarity. Deborah believed that because she had raised me, she owned the literal fruit of my labor. In her twisted maternal logic, my 48 months of $412 payments were merely an extension of her own bank account, a resource to be harvested whenever Mackenzie's credit card debt became too loud to ignore. She saw my discipline not as a virtue to be respected, but as a surplus to be exploited. I didn't let a single tear fall, because tears are for those who still believe in the possibility of a mistake. I walked back to my desk, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, and pulled up my encrypted Dropbox account. I am a junior logistics coordinator. My entire professional life is built on the foundation of redundancy and digital paper trails. On the day I left the dealership in 2019, before I had even driven the Toyota Camry off the lot, I had used the high-resolution scanner at my office to create a digital duplicate of the original pristine title. I clicked through the folders, personal financial assets, until the PDF flickered onto the screen. There it was, the original document in all its glory, devoid of any forged signatures, a digital ghost of the ownership she thought she had successfully stolen. I stared at the VIN number, the same one I had verified on Broughton Street just hours ago, and felt the power shift. She had the physical paper, but I had the truth, and in the world of logistics, the truth is the only currency that actually clears the bank. I opened a new spreadsheet, the white cells of the grid looking like a clean slate waiting for a reckoning. At the very top, in the header cell, I typed the words in bold black letters, Project Restitution. This wasn't going to be a messy family argument filled with histrionics and hollow apologies. This was going to be an audit. I began to build the framework of their downfall with the same precision I used to track 20-ton shipping containers across the Atlantic. I created columns for every cent I had poured into that house over the last 3 years, the property taxes I had already paid, the $500 monthly contributions that had clearly been diverted, the cost of the laminate flooring, and the repair bills for the appliances Jason had broken. I sat there for hours, the only sound the rapid-fire clicking of my mechanical keyboard. I calculated the exact market value of the 2019 Camry at the time of its theft, adjusting for the low mileage and the excellent condition I had maintained. I added the $3,200 cost of the unauthorized vinyl wrap, as I intended to hold them liable for the restoration of the vehicle's original finish. I even included the $12 fee from the pawn shop receipt I had found earlier, a small but vital line item in the ledger of their betrayal. As the spreadsheet grew, the numbers began to tell a story of systemic financial abuse that would make a forensic accountant weep. While they were sleeping soundly, dreaming of Mackenzie's influencer fame and Jason's Florida jet ski fantasies, I was quantifying their debt to me down to the last decimal point. I thought about the 1.2-mile walk in the freezing rain, the soaked shoes, and the $9.50 latte Mackenzie had sipped while sitting in my stolen seat. Every detail became a data point. I realized that my mother had likely used the property tax lien story as a double blind. She probably expected me to eventually offer up my savings to pay a debt that didn't exist, and when I didn't move fast enough, she simply took the car instead. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, but it was built on a foundation of sand. She had forgotten that the reliable daughter was also the one who managed the passwords, the one who kept the records, and the one who knew exactly how to trigger a legal landslide. By 4 a.m., Project Restitution was no longer just a spreadsheet. It was a comprehensive map of their liability. I had links to the digital scans of every receipt, the GPS coordinates of where I had seen the car, and a draft of a police report that included the specific details of the forged signature and the broken safe. I looked at the electric neon purple monster in my mind and saw it for what it was, a blinking beacon of evidence. They had made the mistake of making my stolen property the most visible object in Savannah. They thought I would stay quiet to protect the family name, but they failed to realize that they had already dragged that name through the mud of forgery and theft. My name was Riley Vance, and while my sister was building a brand on filters and lies, I was building a case on facts and figures. The energy drink was empty now, the metallic taste lingering on my tongue like the promise of a cold winter. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from the tension, and looked out the window as the first faint hint of dawn began to bleed into the Georgia sky. The driveway was still empty, but the emptiness no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a vacuum that was about to pull their entire world into it. I had spent 24 years being the logistics coordinator for their failures, ensuring that the consequences of their actions never quite reached the front door. Project Restitution was the end of that service. Tomorrow, or rather today, the deliveries of their own making would finally arrive, and there would be no one at the port to redirect the shipment. I closed my laptop with a definitive click, the sound echoing in the dark room like the cocking of a hammer. The audit had begun, and by the time I was finished, the family jewel would find out exactly how much it cost to wear a stolen crown. I walked to the kitchen to start the coffee, my movements silent and purposeful. I passed my mother's bedroom door and heard her light, rhythmic snoring, the sound of a woman who believed she had solved all her problems. She had no idea that at 2:45 a.m., Her daughter had stopped being a daughter and had become a creditor. I stood at the counter where the ceramic rooster sat, its painted eyes staring blankly at the wall, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The $12 paper trail had led me to the $3,200 wrap, which had led me to the forged title, and now all roads led to the same destination, a complete and total restructuring of the Vance family assets. I poured the water into the machine, the sound of the reservoir filling echoing the cold, steady resolve in my heart. They wanted to play with property and signatures? Fine. We would play by the rules of the state of Georgia, and I was going to make sure every single line item was settled in full. The contrast in our house was about to be corrected, not with a tuna sandwich or a bus ride, but with a legal reality that no amount of neon purple vinyl could ever hide. The next morning, the Georgia sky was a flat, oppressive gray that seemed to mirror the cold, clinical finality of my resolve. I didn't wait for my mother to wake up and offer me another fabricated story about tax liens or family sacrifices, and I didn't wait for Jason to stumble out of his room with his usual hungover entitlement. Instead, I stood at the edge of the driveway where my 2019 Galactic Aqua Mica Toyota Camry used to be, adjusted the strap of my professional laptop bag over my shoulder, and began the long walk toward the bus stop for the last time. My destination wasn't the logistics firm at the port, but the Chatham County Police Precinct, a squat utilitarian building that sat like a concrete fortress against the backdrop of Savannah's historic oaks and Spanish moss. As I stepped through the heavy glass doors, the atmosphere shifted instantly from the humid, floral sweetness of the morning air to a sharp, aggressive scent of industrial bleach and burnt, old coffee that had been sitting in a pot since the night shift began. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low-frequency buzz that vibrated in my teeth, but I felt remarkably calm, a woman who had traded her emotions for a comprehensive set of data points and a singular, unwavering mission. I walked up to the high, scarred wooden counter and waited for the officer on duty to acknowledge me, my fingers tight around the edges of a crisp, heavy manila folder that contained the blueprint for my family's overdue reckoning. When Sergeant Brooks finally looked up from his computer, a man whose face was etched with the weary lines of 20 years spent navigating the petty and profound cruelties of the city, I didn't lead with a trembling voice or a story about a mother who had betrayed her daughter. I simply laid the folder flat on the counter and introduced myself with the same level of detached professionalism I used when reporting a lost shipping container in the Atlantic. Inside that folder was the undeniable architecture of my ownership, my original $22,400 bill of sale from the Savannah Toyota dealership, the digital scan of the original title that Deborah thought she had successfully replaced with a forgery, and a stack of printed GPS logs from my insurance company's telematics app. I pointed to the last recorded location of the vehicle on the map, a quiet street in the Starland district where Mackenzie's luxury condo was located, though I offered no explanation as to why it might be there. I told Sergeant Brooks that I was there to report my vehicle as stolen, and when he asked if I had any suspects, I looked him directly in the eye and stated that the car had been taken from my driveway by persons unknown while I was in the shower. I didn't tell him it was my mother who had forced open my $120 biometric safe. I didn't tell him it was my sister who was currently using my hard-earned asset as a prop for her digital vanity. I wanted the legal system to engage with them not as my flesh and blood, but as the common, predatory criminals they had chosen to become the moment they forged my signature. I provided the specific, unmistakable identifying marks for the BOLO alert, the Be on the Lookout bulletin that would be broadcast to every patrol car in the county. I described the vehicle not as the sophisticated teal-blue Camry I had purchased, but as the garish, electric neon purple monstrosity I had seen on Broughton Street. I made sure to mention the 4-inch curb scratch on the rear passenger side wheel and the faulty serpentine belt that emitted a high-pitched whine whenever the engine was under load, details that would make it impossible for any officer to mistake my car for any other purple sedan in the city. As Sergeant Brooks typed the information into the system, the The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard felt like the ticking of a countdown clock that my family didn't even know had started. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting area, watching the clock on the wall and thinking about the $3,200 vinyl wrap that Mackenzie was so proud of. She had spent a fortune of stolen money to make the car as visible as possible, effectively painting a giant glowing target on her own back. She wanted attention, she wanted eyes on her, and she wanted to be seen. Now I was ensuring that the people looking at her would be wearing badges and carrying handcuffs. There was a profound, icy satisfaction in the irony of it, that her own narcissism was the very thing that would facilitate her downfall. The more she posted her filtered selfies and lifestyle updates from the driver's seat, the more evidence she was broadcasting to the local authorities. I had spent years being the one who hid their messes, the one who smoothed over the cracks in our family's foundation. But as I sat in that precinct smelling the bleach and the old coffee, I realized I was finally doing the most loving thing I could for myself. I was letting the truth be as loud and as ugly as it actually was. The sergeant handed me a case number, the ink still fresh on the small slip of thermal paper, and told me that a vehicle with that specific wrap and a reported mechanical whine wouldn't stay hidden for long in a city the size of Savannah. I thanked him, tucked the paper into my wallet next to the $12 pawnshop receipt, and walked out of the precinct into the bright, unforgiving light of the Georgia sun. I felt lighter than I had in years, as if the weight of their expectations and their constant, draining needs had been transferred entirely onto the shoulders of the Chatham County Sheriff's Office. I wasn't Riley the daughter or Riley the sister anymore. I was Riley the victim of a felony auto theft, and I was going to follow this process through to its absolute legal conclusion. I thought about the tuna sandwich sitting in my bag, a symbol of the austerity I had lived by while they feasted on my labor. And for the first time, I didn't feel the bitterness of the sacrifice. I felt the power of the leverage it had given me. Every dollar I had saved and every receipt I had kept was now a weapon in a war they hadn't even realized I was fighting. I walked toward the bus stop, not with the slumped shoulders of a woman defeated by a freezing rainstorm, but with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had just initiated a high-stakes logistical realignment. My mother was likely at home right now, perhaps sitting at the kitchen table with her ceramic rooster, feeling smug about her ability to manipulate me. Mackenzie was likely waking up in her 1,100-square-foot luxury condo, reaching for her $420 Celine sunglasses and planning her next photo shoot in the purple-wrapped Camry. They believed they had won, that they had successfully liquidated my future to pay for their present, but they were about to discover that the law doesn't care about family dynamics or greater goods. The law cares about bill of sales, original titles, and forged signatures. The family jewel was about to be caught in the high-beam glare of a reality she couldn't filter away, and I was going to be the one standing on the sidelines, holding the ledger that proved exactly how much she owed. The bus arrived, and as I climbed the steps and found a seat by the window, I looked out at the streets of Savannah and realized that the city looked different now. It no longer felt like a place where I was just surviving. It felt like a map of my coming triumph. I opened my phone and checked the insurance app one last time, seeing that the GPS signal was still active, broadcasting a steady, rhythmic pulse from the Starland district. It was the heartbeat of my car, calling out to the precinct I had just left, a digital trail that would lead the police straight to the doorstep of the sister who thought her espresso machine was too loud. I closed the app, leaned my head against the cool glass of the bus window, and allowed myself a single small smile. The audit was no longer just on my laptop. It was out in the world, moving through the radio waves and the police scanners, a silent, relentless force that was closing in on the people who had mistaken my silence for weakness. Project Restitution was in full swing, and by the time the sun set on this Tuesday, the Vance family would learn that the most dangerous person to rob is the one who knows exactly how to track what's missing. The humid Savannah night was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant, rhythmic thumping of bass coming from the rooftop of the Peregrine, one of the most exclusive bars in the historic district. This was the setting for Mackenzie's self-proclaimed brand launch party, a carefully choreographed spectacle designed to announce her arrival as a premier lifestyle influencer to 60 hand-picked guests who existed in the same bubble of superficiality and unearned confidence. I stood in the shadows across the street, leaning against the cold brick of a 19th-century warehouse, my $22 work pants blending into the darkness and my heart beating with the steady, mechanical precision of a stopwatch. I had spent the last several hours tracking the GPS pings on my phone, watching the little blue dot that represented my stolen life as it moved from her luxury condo toward the heart of the city. I knew exactly what was about to happen because I was the one who had mapped the coordinates, provided the VIN, and handed the police the mechanical blueprint of the betrayal. I watched as the valets, dressed in crisp white shirts and black vests, scurried around the entrance of the hotel, and then I heard it, the unmistakable, high-pitched metallic whine of a faulty serpentine belt that no amount of neon purple vinyl could ever silence. At exactly 9:15 p.m., my 2019 Toyota Camry rolled into the valet line like a neon-lit Trojan horse, the electric neon purple wrap shimmering under the streetlights with a garish, oily luster that cost $3,200 of my stolen equity. Mackenzie was in the driver's seat, her silhouette visible through the glass as she checked her reflection one last time in the rearview mirror, probably adjusting those $420 Celine sunglasses even though the sun had set hours ago. She stepped out of the car with the practiced air of a queen ascending a throne, tossing her hair back and handing the keys to a bewildered valet as if she were granting him a royal favor. She was draped in a silk slip dress that likely cost a month's worth of my utility payments, and she carried herself with a level of audacity that made my skin crawl. Above us, on the rooftop, I could see the flickering lights and the silhouettes of her guests enjoying $1,200 worth of artisanal catering, charcuterie boards, microgreens, and imported cheeses, all funded by the liquidation of the vehicle she had just vacated. She was at the pinnacle of her delusion, a woman who believed she had successfully traded her sister's future for a night of curated applause. But the logistics of justice are far more reliable than the fleeting engagement of a social media following. At 9:22 p.m., the atmosphere of the street shifted with a sudden, violent finality that silenced the distant music in my ears. 2 Savannah Police Department patrol units, their engines low and predatory, rounded the corner of the cobblestone street and surged toward the valet stand with their blue and red lights dark, utilizing a tactical positioning I had discussed with Sergeant Brooks only 24 hours prior. They didn't care about the guest list, the brand synergy, or the fact that Mackenzie was currently live streaming her entrance to 3,000 bots and a handful of envious strangers. They saw a flagged VIN number that had been broadcast on every police scanner in the county and a stolen vehicle report that was backed by a verified bill of sale and a digital paper trail. The patrol units screeched to a halt, effectively boxing the purple Camry into the curb and blocking the only exit for the valet line, their tires kicking up a cloud of dust and grit that settled on Mackenzie's expensive silk hem. The scene transformed from a high-fashion photo shoot into a high-stakes felony stop in a matter of seconds. 2 officers stepped out of the lead vehicle, their movements crisp and authoritative, their heavy duty belts jingling with the weight of handcuffs, radios, and flashlights. They didn't approach her with the deference she expected. They approached her with their hands resting firmly on their holsters, their bodies angled in a defensive stance that signaled they were prepared for a non-compliant suspect. "Get out of the vehicle and step away from the car now," the lead officer shouted, his voice cutting through the humid Georgia air like a serrated blade. Mackenzie froze, her hand still hovering near her designer bag, her mouth hanging open in a silent, perfectly contoured O of shock. The valet dropped the keys as if they were made of hot coals, backing away with his hands raised, while the guests on the rooftop leaned over the railing, their expensive cocktails forgotten as they looked down at the unfolding disaster. Mackenzie tried to pivot, her influencer instincts momentarily overriding her survival reflex as she began to stammer something about her father, her brand, and a misunderstanding involving a tax lien. "Wait, you don't understand. This is my car. My mother gave it to me." She started to scream, her voice rising into that familiar, hysterical pitch that used to make me back down in order to keep the peace. But the officers weren't her parents, and they weren't me. They were representatives of a legal system that recognizes forged signatures as a felony and stolen property as a crime, regardless of the color of the vinyl wrap. They didn't listen to her explanation because the computer in their dash was telling them a much simpler story. The car belonged to Riley Vance, and it had been reported stolen by persons unknown. I watched from the shadows, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, feeling a cold, crystalline sense of relief. I had spent 24 years being the one who bore the weight of her mistakes, the one who worked the overtime so she could have the violin lessons, the one who packed the tuna sandwiches so she could have the luxury condo. Now, for the first time in our lives, the weight was resting entirely on her. The officers didn't wait for her to finish her monologue. They moved in, one of them taking her by the arm with a firm, professional grip that brooked no argument. They didn't care about her $420 sunglasses, which slid down the bridge of her nose as she was spun around and pressed against the hood of the purple Camry. The very surface she had used as a prop for her vanity was now the cold, hard metal upon which she was being detained. I heard the sharp, metallic ratcheting of handcuffs, a sound that was far more satisfying than the chime of a new follower notification. The guests above were now filming the arrest on their phones, the very audience she had cultivated now, capturing the raw, unedited footage of her downfall. Her brand launch party had become a public record of a criminal investigation, and there was no filter in the world that could soften the glare of the police lights as they were finally flicked on, bathing the street in a rhythmic, accusing strobe of red and blue. I watched as they searched her, pulling the keys to the luxury condo and the $12 pawnshop receipt's consequences out of her bag. She was sobbing now, a messy, ugly sound that had nothing to do with a quiet espresso machine and everything to do with the realization that the world was finally pushing back. They led her toward the back of the patrol unit, her silk dress snagging on the doorframe, her status as the family jewel dissolving into the cold reality of a Chatham County booking number. I didn't step forward to save her. I didn't reveal myself. I simply stood in the darkness, a ghost in $22 pants, and checked the time on my phone. 9:28 p.m. The logistics of the evening were proceeding exactly as scheduled. The car was recovered, the suspect was in custody, and the paper trail I had meticulously laid was holding firm under the pressure of the law. As the patrol car pulled away, its tires crunching over the glass of a dropped champagne flute from the rooftop, I felt the final tether to my family's toxic cycle snap. They had thought my silence was a sign of weakness, but it was actually the silence of an auditor waiting for the right moment to close the books. Mackenzie was heading to a cell that wouldn't have a floor-to-ceiling view of the Starland district, and Deborah was going to wake up to a phone call that no amount of manipulative gaslighting could fix. The contrast in our house had been disgusting, a landscape of inequality where I was the soil and she was the flower, but I had finally decided to stop providing the nutrients. I walked away from the warehouse, heading toward the bus stop with a steady, purposeful gait, the sound of the police sirens fading into the distance like the last notes of a dark, necessary symphony. Project Restitution was no longer just a spreadsheet on my laptop. It was a living, breathing reality, and for the first time in 24 years, the only person I was responsible for was Riley Vance. I felt the humid air on my face and realized that while the car was still purple and the serpentine belt was still broken, the ownership was no longer in question. I had my life back, and the cost of the recovery was a price I was more than willing to let them pay. The public execution of my family's carefully curated reputation was a masterclass in poetic justice, unfolding under the harsh, flickering neon of Broughton Street with a precision that even my best logistics manifests couldn't match. as the red and blue emergency lights of the Chatham County Patrol Unit strobed against the historic brick facades, bathing the electric neon purple monstrosity in a rhythmic pulse of clinical condemnation. The final act of my mother's long con began. Deborah arrived at the scene in a frantic, uncoordinated rush, her 2012 silver Honda Civic, a car that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation, screeching to a halt behind the police perimeter. She tumbled out of the driver's seat with her hair disheveled and her face a mask of practiced maternal outrage, immediately pushing toward the officers with her hands raised in a gesture of false supplication. She began to wail, a high-pitched performative sound designed to garner sympathy from the gathering crowd, trying to explain to Sergeant Brooks and his partner that this was all a massive, tragic misunderstanding between a mother and her ungrateful daughter. She actually had the audacity to claim, in front of 60 witnesses and a rotating array of smartphone cameras, that the car was a family asset and that she had merely reallocated it to prevent a fictional property tax lien from making us homeless. I chose that exact moment to step out of the deep, velvety shadows of the warehouse across the street, moving with a terrifyingly calm deliberation that made the air feel thin. I wasn't the shivering girl who had walked 1.2 miles in a freezing rainstorm anymore. I was a woman holding a $15 notarized affidavit that functioned as a death warrant for their lies. I walked directly into the center of the illuminated circle, the light catching the sharp edges of the manila folder in my hands, and I looked my mother directly in her watery, deceitful eyes. "The car was never yours to give, Mom," I said, my voice projecting with a cold, resonant clarity that cut through her hysterics like a scalpel through soft tissue. The silence that followed was absolute, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the bass from the rooftop bar where Mackenzie's brand launch party was currently dying a public, humiliating death. I didn't wait for her to respond with another fabrication. Instead, I turned toward the officers and opened my folder, revealing a printed log of the digital timestamps from my $120 biometric safe. I showed them the exact second, 2:14 a.m. on Monday, when the safe had been forced open, a time that correlated perfectly with my mother's presence in the house and completely contradicted her story of a legal midday transfer of property. The crowd of Mackenzie's friends, a collection of hollowed-out socialites and aspiring influencers who lived for the very drama they were now witnessing, didn't move to help her. Instead, they did what they were trained to do. They lifted their $1,000 iPhones and began filming every second of the Vance family's implosion. They captured the raw, unedited footage of the Golden Girl as she was forced to lean her forehead against the metallic purple hood of my stolen car, her $600 designer silk dress bunching ungracefully around her waist. The technical details of her downfall were visible in high definition. The $90 waterproof mascara she had applied so carefully that afternoon was finally failing, running in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks like ink on a damp map. She looked less like a lifestyle icon and more like a cornered animal, her Celine sunglasses lying forgotten on the grease-stained pavement of the valet lane. The contrast was staggering. The girl who complained about a loud espresso machine was now listening to the heavy, metallic clink of handcuffs being tightened around her wrists by an officer who didn't care about her engagement metrics. My mother tried to pivot her attack toward me, her face contorting into a snarl of pure, unfiltered venom as she realized the reliable daughter was no longer playing her part in the script. "Riley, how could you do this to your sister?" she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating tremor of manipulation. "You're destroying her future over a piece of metal." But I stood my ground, my $22 work pants a badge of honor in a sea of stolen luxury. I pointed to the electric neon purple wrap, the $3,200 vanity project that had been bought with the equity of my 4 years of labor. "I'm not destroying her future, Mom. I'm just auditing the past," I replied, my fingers tracing the edge of the $15 affidavit that proved my legal standing. I explained to the officers, loud enough for every recording phone to hear, how my mother had forged my signature on a vehicle title she had stolen from a locked safe, and how they had used a fake tax lien of $6,840 to gaslight me into silence. The look of pure, panicked realization that crossed Deborah's face was more satisfying than any monetary compensation could ever be. She looked at the crowd, at the officers, and then at the purple car, realizing that she had painted a target so bright that no amount of lying could ever make it invisible. The officers didn't hesitate. They had the bill of sale, they had the digital proof of the safe breach, and they had a suspect caught in the act of operating a stolen vehicle. Sergeant Brooks looked at Mackenzie, then at Deborah, and then at me, giving a sharp, professional nod that signaled the end of the conversation. He signaled to his partner, who took my mother by the arm, informing her that she was being detained for questioning regarding a felony forgery and grand theft auto. The family jewel was now a family felony, and as the two of them were led toward the separate patrol units, the crowd on the sidewalk began to whisper and hum with the frantic energy of people who had just witnessed a viral moment in the making. Mackenzie's brand was dead before it had even launched. Her reputation was now forever linked to the image of her being pressed against a stolen car in a purple wrap, her face a ruined mess of expensive makeup and cheap lies. She cried out for our father, but Jerry was miles away in his recliner, unaware that the daughter he had consistently overlooked had just dismantled the house of cards he had allowed his wife to build. I stood there on the curb as the tow truck arrived to impound my vehicle, the driver carefully winching the purple Camry onto the flatbed. The high-pitched whine of the serpentine belt gave one last pathetic chirp as the engine was killed for the final time under their control. I looked at the $12 pawnshop receipt that was still tucked in my pocket, the tiny scrap of paper that had started this avalanche of truth. It felt heavy, like a piece of lead that had finally been balanced on the scales of justice. The public execution was perfect because it was honest. It stripped away the filters, the lifestyle branding, and the maternal gaslighting to reveal the rot underneath. My mother and sister weren't victims of circumstance. They were architects of a betrayal that had cost me 4 years of my life. And tonight, the bill had finally come due with interest. I didn't feel a shred of guilt as I watched the patrol cars pull away, the red and blue lights fading into the distance and taking the noise of their toxicity with them. I turned away from the valet stand, ignoring the lingering gazes of the 60 guests who were already busy uploading their footage to various platforms with hashtags like scandal and caught. I walked toward the bus stop, the cool night air of Savannah finally feeling clean as it hit my face. I thought about the spreadsheet titled Project Restitution on my laptop, the grid of numbers that was now being translated into real-world consequences. I had been the logistics coordinator for their chaos for far too long, managing the shipments of their lies and rerouting the damage they caused to my own soul. But as I sat on the hard bench of the bus stop, waiting for the 10:45 p.m. route back to a house that would finally be quiet, I realized that my job was done. The shipment had been delivered, the audit was complete, and the ownership of my life had been officially restored to the only person who had ever truly paid for it. I was Riley Vance, 24 years old, and for the first time in my existence, the golden girl wasn't the one shining. I was the one standing in the light of my own integrity, while they disappeared into the dark, backseat reality of their own making. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes, a mundane, reliable sound that I now found comforting. I climbed aboard, paid my fare with a steady hand, and looked out the window as we passed the boutique cafe on Broughton Street one last time. The neon purple car was gone, the rooftop bar was emptying, and the $12 paper trail had reached its end. I leaned my head against the glass and watched the city of Savannah go by, a map of a life I was finally allowed to lead on my own terms. Family isn't the people who share your blood and steal your breath. Family is the bridge you build to a future where you don't have to hide your safe or pack a tuna sandwich just to survive the greed of the people you love. As the bus rumbled toward Willow Creek Road, I knew the locks on the door would be different tomorrow, and the only person with the key would be me. The restitution was more than a car or a tax bill. It was the quiet, undeniable weight of a truth that no one could ever forge again. The fallout from that Friday night was total and catastrophic, a structural collapse of the Vance family dynamic that was as inevitable as it was deserved. By Monday morning, the reality of their choices had manifested into a series of legal and financial anchors that would drag them down for years to come. Mackenzie, the once glimmering family jewel who believed her aesthetic was a shield against the law, was formally processed and is currently facing a felony charge for possession of stolen property in the first degree. The digital footprint she worked so hard to create, the videos of her laughing in the driver's seat of my car, the selfies with her $420 Celine sunglasses reflecting the neon purple vinyl, had been subpoenaed and transformed into Exhibit A. There was no influencer filter strong enough to blur the fact that she was operating a vehicle she knew was stolen, and the Savannah legal system had no interest in her engagement metrics or her brand synergy. She was no longer a rising star in the Starland district. She was a defendant with a booking number, waiting for a court date that would determine if her luxury condo would be replaced by a prison cell. The financial desperation that followed was a mirror image of the poverty they had tried to force upon me. Deborah, the woman who had once gasped into a cheap paper napkin about a fictional $6,840 tax lien, now found herself drowning in a very real sea of debt. To keep her favorite child from a felony conviction, she was forced to walk into a high-interest lending office on Abercorn Street and take out a $20,000 personal loan with a predatory 24% APR. The money didn't go toward the house or the taxes she claimed were so urgent. It went directly into the pockets of a high-priced defense attorney whose retainer fee consumed the entire sum in less than 48 hours. I watched from a distance as she liquidated what was left of her pride, realizing that the $12 paper trail I had discovered was just the first domino in a sequence that would eventually leave her house truly vulnerable to the very locks she had used to threaten me. My own departure was not a frantic escape, but a meticulously planned logistical extraction that took place that following Sunday at exactly 10 a.m. While the house on Willow Creek Road was silent, heavy with the suffocating atmosphere of resentment and impending ruin, I loaded the final remnants of my life into a rented U-Haul truck. I didn't leave a note, and I didn't ask for a goodbye. I moved into a clean, quiet studio apartment 50 miles away from the humidity and the memories of Savannah, a space that featured white walls, a view of a park, and a door that required a code only I possessed. There was a profound, medicinal quality to the silence of that new apartment. It was the sound of a life that no longer had to account for the greed of others. I sat on my floor among the boxes, drinking a glass of water that didn't taste like betrayal, and I felt the weight of 24 years of being the reliable one finally lifting off my shoulders. I took my car back from the police impound lot on Monday afternoon. Seeing the 2019 Toyota Camry again was like seeing a wounded friend. I spent 6 hours in the driveway of my new building, my hands covered in a specialized adhesive remover that cost $45 as I began the grueling process of stripping the electric neon purple wrap off the body. I peeled back the garish, shimmering plastic in long, jagged sheets, revealing the pristine galactic aqua mica paint underneath. Every square inch of the original teal blue that I uncovered felt like a victory, a restoration of the person I had been before they tried to paint over me. Underneath the wrap, the 4-inch curb scratch from 2021 was still there, a humble reminder of my own history that I now looked upon with affection. Once the car was restored to its original state, I drove it to a reputable dealership 2 towns over. I didn't want the reminder of their theft sitting in my new parking space, so I sold it for $16,500, a fair market price for a vehicle of its condition and mileage. That money didn't go toward a jet ski business or an influencer launch. It went into a high-yield savings account to serve as the foundation for a life built on my own terms. The transformation was complete. The $12 paper trail had led to a $16,500 fresh start, and the contrast that had once defined my existence was finally resolved. My mother and sister had spent years treating my labor as their property, but they had failed to realize that the most dangerous person to rob is the one who keeps the books. They had mistaken my discipline for docility and my silence for acceptance, never imagining that I was capable of treating my own mother like a complete stranger in a court of law. But to protect my future, I had to become the auditor they feared. I had to look past the blood relation and see the criminal intent, recognizing that family is not a bond that grants a license to steal, but a commitment to mutual respect that they had long ago discarded. The logistics of my life are now simple, streamlined, and entirely under my control. I still work as a logistics coordinator, but now I apply those skills to my own joy rather than my family's survival. I no longer wear $22 scrub pants out of necessity, though I still appreciate the value of $1 earned through honest effort. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening, I think about the house on Willow Creek Road and the ceramic rooster on the counter, and I wonder if Deborah ever found the $12 receipt I left face up on the table before I walked out. I wonder if she looks at the empty driveway and finally understands the cost of her forgery. But those thoughts are fleeting, like the whine of a faulty serpentine belt fading into the distance. My name is Riley Vance, and I have learned that the only way to truly save a house is to make sure you are the only one who holds the deed to your soul. The $12 paper trail ended in a courtroom and a quiet apartment, a journey that proved that integrity is a currency that never devalues. My sister's brand was built on a foundation of stolen purple vinyl, and it collapsed under the weight of a single notarized affidavit. My mother's authority was built on the lie that she owned my breath, and it vanished the moment I reported the truth to a man with a badge. I am 24 years old, and for the first time, the spreadsheet of my life is perfectly balanced. I have my dignity, I have my savings, and I have the knowledge that I was strong enough to do what was necessary to survive the people who were supposed to love me. Family is not who you are born to. Family is the people who don't make you lock your safe when you go to work. I have found my peace in the distance, and the audit of the Vance family is officially, permanently closed. As I sit in my new kitchen, the sun setting over a horizon that they will never see from their porch, I realize that the greatest moral of this story isn't about revenge. It's about the fact that your worth is never someone else's to decide or to liquidate. If you find yourself in a house where your labor is being harvested and your future is being sold for someone else's vanity, remember that the law, the truth, and your own resolve are the only tools you need to rebuild. I am no longer the daughter who pays for everyone's mistakes. I am the woman who owns her own success. The neon purple is gone. The lies have been documented, and the only person I am responsible for is the one looking back at me in the mirror. I have moved on, 50 miles away, and a lifetime ahead of the people who thought they could break me. And in this clean, quiet studio, the only sound I hear is the steady, peaceful rhythm of a life that is finally, undeniably mine.